The Admiral's laughter echoed across the Naval Base Command Center, loud enough to silence every conversation in the room. "You're telling me," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief, "that this is our cybersecurity specialist? This girl?" Irene Hill stood motionless in the doorway, her worn laptop bag clutched against her chest, her eyes fixed on the floor. At 26, with her slight frame and perpetually nervous demeanor, she looked more like a university student who'd wandered into the wrong building than someone hired to protect the nation's most sensitive maritime operations. What the Admiral didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the file sitting on his desk told only half of Irene's story. The other half was redacted for a reason, and in exactly 72 hours, he would understand why. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Station Rotterdam as Irene Hill walked through the main gate for her first day as a civilian contractor. The air smelled of salt water and diesel fuel, a combination that reminded her of why she'd taken this job in the first place. She needed to be near the ocean, even if it meant enduring the skepticism that inevitably came with her appearance. The security checkpoint had been her first test. The guard had looked at her identification badge 3 times, comparing her photo to her face as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. "Cybersecurity Division," he'd asked, his Dutch accent thick with doubt. "You sure you're in the right place, miss?" Irene had simply nodded, too exhausted from her overnight train journey from Vienna to muster a defense. She'd learned years ago that words rarely change people's first impressions. Only results did, and even then, not always. The walk from the gate to the command center took 15 minutes, giving her time to observe the base's layout. Military personnel moved with practiced efficiency between buildings, their uniforms crisp despite the early hour. Irene counted 17 potential access points to the main network infrastructure, 12 of which showed obvious vulnerabilities that she could exploit within minutes. Not that she would mention this in her first meeting. Experience had taught her that people didn't appreciate having their weaknesses pointed out by someone who looked like she should be serving coffee, not securing classified systems. The command center was a 3-story concrete structure that dominated the eastern section of the base. Its windows were reinforced with wire mesh, and cameras monitored every entrance. Impressive to civilian eyes, perhaps, but Irene noticed that the cameras were positioned incorrectly, leaving blind spots that any competent infiltrator could exploit. She made a mental note to include this in her first security assessment, assuming anyone actually bothered to read it. Inside, the building hummed with activity. Officers moved between offices, carrying folders marked with various classification levels. Enlisted personnel manned communication stations, their conversations a mixture of Dutch and English that created a constant background noise. Irene followed the directions she'd been given, climbing 2 flights of stairs to reach the Cybersecurity Division's temporary office space. The office was smaller than she'd expected, barely large enough for the 3 desks and filing cabinets crammed inside. 2 of the desks were already occupied. A middle-aged man with graying hair looked up as she entered, his expression neutral. The younger man beside him, probably in his early 30s, allowed his gaze to travel from her scuffed boots to her oversized cardigan with undisguised amusement. "You must be the new contractor," the older man said, standing to offer his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Vanderberg. This is Petty Officer Decker." "You're Irene Hill?" "Yes, sir," Irene replied, shaking his hand. Her grip was firm, despite her small stature, something her father had insisted she perfect years ago. "Thank you for the opportunity to work here." Vanderberg nodded, but Decker snorted softly. "Opportunity," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "That's one way to describe it." Irene ignored him, setting her laptop bag on the empty desk in the corner. The desk faced the wall, which suited her fine. She'd never been comfortable with people watching her work anyway. "Admiral Rourke wants to meet you this morning," Vanderberg said, consulting his watch. The briefing starts at 0900 hours. That gives you about 30 minutes to settle in. The Admiral likes punctuality. I'll be ready, Irene assured him. After Vanderberg left, Decker wheeled his chair closer to her desk. So, he said, his tone conversational and his eyes calculating. What makes you qualified to handle naval cybersecurity? You look like you just graduated from secondary school. Irene continued unpacking her equipment, connecting her laptop to the base's network with practiced efficiency. I have relevant experience, she said quietly. Relevant experience, Decker repeated, laughing. That's what they all say. Let me guess, you fixed computers for your friends at university, maybe helped your professor recover a lost file. Something like that, Irene replied, refusing to take the bait. She'd had this conversation countless times before, in different countries with different people who all shared the same skepticism. Defending herself never worked. Time and results were the only arguments that mattered. The briefing room was packed when Irene arrived at 8:55. Officers of various ranks filled the chairs arranged in neat rows facing a podium and large display screen. She took a seat in the back corner, hoping to observe without drawing attention. That hope died the moment Admiral Rourke entered the room. James Rourke was exactly what Irene had expected from his personnel file. Tall, powerfully built, despite his 58 years, with silver hair, cut military short, and eyes that missed nothing. He commanded attention simply by existing, his presence filling the room like a physical force. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Good morning, he began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled personnel. We're here to discuss the implementation of new cybersecurity protocols across all naval operations in the northern sector. As you're aware, recent incidents have demonstrated vulnerabilities in our current systems. We've brought in civilian contractors to address these issues. His eyes found Irene in the back corner, and something like amusement flickered across his face. Ah, yes, our cybersecurity specialist has arrived. Miss Hill, would you please stand so everyone can see who will be protecting our classified systems? Irene's stomach knotted, but she stood, feeling every eye in the room turned toward her. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning system. Then Admiral Rourke laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a full, booming laugh that echoed off the walls. You're telling me, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, that this is our cybersecurity specialist, this girl. Several officers joined in the laughter, though some looked uncomfortable. Irene remained standing, her face burning, but her expression carefully neutral. She'd learned to hide her emotions years ago, to present a blank canvas that revealed nothing of the hurt and anger churning inside her. With all due respect, Admiral, Vanderberg interjected, Miss Hill comes highly recommended. Her credentials are— I'm sure her credentials are impressive on paper, Rourke interrupted, still smiling. But credentials don't mean much when you're facing actual threats. This is naval security we're discussing, not some corporate IT department. He turned back to Irene. How old are you, Miss Hill? 22. 23. 26, sir, Irene replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. 26, Rourke repeated, as if this proved his point. And you think you're qualified to handle security for an entire naval station? Have you ever even served in the military? No, sir, I'm a civilian contractor. Exactly, a civilian. Rourke shook his head, his amusement fading into something closer to irritation. Lieutenant Commander Vanderberg, I want to know who approved this hire. We need serious professionals, not children playing at cybersecurity. The briefing continued for another 45 minutes, but Irene barely heard a word of it. She sat in her corner seat, maintaining her neutral expression while her mind raced through scenarios. This wasn't the first time she'd faced skepticism, but Admiral Rourke's public dismissal was particularly brutal. The looks she received from other officers ranged from pity to contempt, and she knew that her credibility on the base was damaged before she'd even begun. When the briefing finally ended, Irene was the first to leave, slipping out while Rourke was still answering questions from senior staff. She made her way back to the cybersecurity office, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The morning had started with hope. Now it felt like every other assignment she'd taken in the past 3 years. Prove yourself, they said. Show us what you can do. But the moment she walked through the door, judgments were made based on her age, her appearance, her quiet demeanor. Back in the office, Decker was waiting with barely suppressed glee. "That went well," he said, spinning in his chair to face her. "I've never seen the Admiral laugh that hard during a briefing. You've made quite an impression." Irene sat at her desk and opened her laptop, refusing to engage. She had work to do, regardless of whether anyone believed she was capable of doing it. "Come on," Decker pressed. "You have to admit it's a bit ridiculous. You're what, 50 kilograms soaking wet? And they expect you to handle security for an entire naval station. It's insulting to those of us who've actually served." "I'm here to do a job," Irene said quietly, her fingers already flying across the keyboard. "That's all that matters." "A job you're not qualified for," Decker countered. "Look, nothing personal, but this is serious business. Lives depend on these systems. We can't afford to have someone learning on the job because they check the right diversity boxes." Irene stopped typing and turned to face him, her green eyes meeting his with unexpected intensity. "You're right that lives depend on these systems," she said, her voice still soft, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Which is why I'm going to do my job, whether you or Admiral Rourke or anyone else believes I'm capable. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an assessment to conduct." Decker opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He turned back to his own computer, muttering something about civilians under his breath. Irene spent the rest of the morning conducting a preliminary network analysis. What she found confirmed her initial observations. The base's cybersecurity was adequate for routine operations, but woefully inadequate against sophisticated threats. The firewall configurations were outdated, password protocols were inconsistent, and several critical systems lacked proper encryption. Most concerning was the evidence of previous intrusion attempts that had gone undetected by the existing security measures. She documented everything methodically, creating a detailed report that would be impossible to dismiss as the work of an amateur. By lunchtime, she'd identified 17 critical vulnerabilities and drafted recommendations for addressing each one. The report was professional, thorough, and would likely be ignored by everyone who mattered. Vanderberg returned to the office just after noon, carrying takeout containers that smelled of fried fish and chips. He offered one to Irene, which she accepted gratefully, having skipped breakfast in her nervousness about the first day. "Don't let the Admiral get to you," Vanderberg said, settling into his chair. "He's old-school military, doesn't trust civilians, especially young ones. It's nothing personal." "It felt personal," Irene replied, then immediately regretted the admission. She prided herself on maintaining professional distance, on not letting emotions cloud her judgment. Vanderberg sighed. "Rourke's been in the Navy for 40 years. He came up through the ranks when things were different. In his mind, security means armed guards and locked doors, not computer networks and encryption protocols. He doesn't understand what you do, so he doesn't respect it." "Will he read my assessment report?" "Eventually, yes, but changing his mind?" Vanderberg shrugged. "That's going to take more than a well-written document. He needs to see results, preferably dramatic ones." Irene nodded, understanding the implication. She would have to prove herself through action, not words. The question was how to do that when she was being actively dismissed and undermined. The afternoon brought her first real taste of the resistance she would face. Irene had requested access to several classified systems to conduct her security assessment, standard procedure for her role. The requests were denied without explanation. When she asked Vanderberg about it, he looked uncomfortable. "Admiral Rourke put a hold on your security clearances," he explained. "He wants to review your background more thoroughly before granting full access." "But that was already done when I was hired," Irene protested. "I went through extensive vetting. My clearances are in my personnel file." I know, but the Admiral has concerns. He's requesting additional verification from your previous employers. Irene felt a cold spike of anxiety. Her previous employers included organizations that couldn't confirm her work due to classification restrictions. The very things that qualified her for this position were things that couldn't be discussed openly. She'd known this might become an issue, but she'd hoped her official credentials would be sufficient. "How long will this review take?" she asked. "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how quickly the responses come back. I can't do my job without access to the systems I'm supposed to be securing." Vanderberg spread his hands helplessly. "I understand the problem, but the Admiral's authority on this base is absolute. If he says you don't get access, you don't get access." That evening, Irene sat in her temporary quarters, a small room in the base's contractor housing, and stared at her laptop screen. She'd drafted an email to her former supervisor at the European Cybersecurity Agency, carefully worded to request assistance without revealing anything classified. But she knew it was futile. The SCSA wouldn't confirm her work there, not even to a military admiral. The operations she'd been involved in were too sensitive, the implications too far-reaching. 3 years ago, Irene had been part of a team that had prevented a catastrophic cyber attack on European infrastructure. The operation had been completely classified, her role redacted from every official record. Only a handful of people knew what she'd actually accomplished, and they were all bound by the same secrecy agreements that now worked against her. She'd left the ECSA not because she wanted to, but because the work had broken something inside her. The constant pressure, the knowledge that millions of lives depended on her decisions, the isolation of working on problems she couldn't discuss with anyone. It had all become too much. Her last operation had ended with her suffering a complete nervous breakdown, hospitalized for 6 weeks, while her mind slowly knitted itself back together. The doctors had been kind, but firm. She needed to step away from high-stakes work, find something less intense, rebuild her emotional resilience. So she'd taken contractor positions, jobs that used her skills without the crushing weight of national security hanging over every decision. She'd thought this naval base assignment would be manageable, a way to contribute without drowning in responsibility. Instead, she'd walked into a situation where her past accomplishments couldn't help her because they couldn't be acknowledged, and her present qualifications were dismissed because of how she looked. A knock on her door interrupted her spiral of dark thoughts. She opened it to find Vanderberg standing in the hallway, his expression serious. "I probably shouldn't be here," he said, "but I thought you should know. Admiral Rourke is meeting with Base Command tomorrow morning. He's going to recommend terminating your contract, says you're not suitable for the position." Irene's stomach dropped. "On what grounds?" "Insufficient qualifications and concerns about security clearance. He's claiming your background check wasn't thorough enough." "That's not true. I was fully vetted before hire." "I know, but perception matters more than truth in these situations. Rourke has influence, and once he's made up his mind about something, he rarely changes it." Vanderberg hesitated, then added, "I've seen your preliminary assessment report. It's good work, really good. You identified vulnerabilities that our own team missed, but I don't think it's going to matter. The Admiral has already decided you're not capable." After Vanderberg left, Irene sat on her bed and allowed herself a moment of despair. She'd traveled across Europe for this opportunity, had pushed herself to try again despite her anxiety, despite the voice in her head that said she should just give up and find work that didn't involve proving herself to skeptical men in positions of authority. But giving up had never been in her nature. Not really. Even when the darkness threatened to overwhelm her, even when every fiber of her being screamed to run away, she'd always found a way to push forward. The question was whether pushing forward would matter this time, or whether Admiral Rourke's prejudice would end her career before it could restart. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Rotterdam's harbour look almost beautiful. Irene had barely slept, her mind cycling through scenarios and solutions until exhaustion finally claimed her. around 3 in the morning. She woke at 6, showered, and dressed in her most professional attire. Dark slacks, a pressed white blouse, and a blazer that made her look slightly less like a student and slightly more like someone who belonged in a naval command center. The cybersecurity office was empty when she arrived, which suited her purposes. She had, perhaps 2 hours before Vanderberg and Decker showed up, 2 hours before Admiral Rourke's meeting with Base Command would seal her fate. 2 hours to do something that might change the equation, or at least go down fighting. Irene pulled up the base's network architecture on her laptop, studying the systems she'd been denied access to. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was supposed to protect these systems, but wasn't trusted enough to examine them properly. Still, there were ways to assess security without full access, methods that lived in the gray area between authorized testing and unauthorized intrusion. She began with passive observation, monitoring network traffic patterns and analyzing the data packets flowing through the base's external connections. Within 20 minutes, she'd identified something that made her blood run cold. An anomaly in the outbound data streams, a pattern that suggested someone was exfiltrating information from the base's classified servers. Irene's fingers flew across the keyboard as she traced the data flow, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of network infrastructure. The exfiltration was sophisticated, designed to mimic legitimate traffic and avoid detection by standard security protocols. Whoever had implemented it knew what they were doing, had probably been inside the network for weeks or even months. She documented everything, taking screenshots and logging the anomalies with timestamps and technical details. This wasn't just a theoretical vulnerability she could point to in a report. This was an active security breach, exactly the kind of threat that Admiral Rourke claimed to be concerned about. By 8 o'clock, she had enough evidence to present a compelling case. The question was whether anyone would listen to her before the Admiral's meeting concluded and her contract was terminated. She saved her findings to an encrypted file and sat back, considering her options. Vanderberg arrived at 8:15, surprised to find her already at her desk. "You're here early," he observed, setting down his coffee. "Couldn't sleep, and I found something," Irene said, turning her laptop to show him the data analysis. "There's an active breach in the base's network. Someone's stealing classified information." Vanderberg leaned closer, his eyes scanning the technical details. His expression shifted from polite interest to genuine alarm as he understood what he was seeing. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 6 weeks, possibly longer. The exfiltration is small-scale, designed to avoid triggering alerts, but the cumulative data loss is significant." "And you found this without full system access?" "I found it by analyzing traffic patterns that don't require special clearance to observe. But to stop it, to trace it back to its source, I'll need access to the systems Admiral Rourke has denied me." Vanderberg straightened, his jaw tight. "The Admiral's meeting starts in 30 minutes. If what you're saying is true, he needs to see this immediately." "Will he believe me?" "He'll have to. This is exactly the kind of threat he's been worried about." Vanderberg grabbed his phone. "I'm calling his office now." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of activity. Vanderberg spoke urgently with the Admiral's aide, while Irene refined her presentation, stripping away technical jargon to create something that could be understood by non-specialists. She knew she would have one chance to make her case, one opportunity to prove that her capabilities extended beyond what her appearance suggested. At 8:45, Vanderberg's phone rang. He listened for a moment, then looked at Irene. "The Admiral will see you now. His office. Immediately." Irene grabbed her laptop and followed Vanderberg through the command center's corridors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd spent years perfecting. The moment when technical expertise mattered more than first impressions. Admiral Rourke's office occupied a corner of the building's top floor with windows overlooking the harbor. He sat behind a massive desk, his expression skeptical as Irene and Vanderberg entered. Two other officers were present, Captain Verhagen, the base's executive officer, and Commander Peterson, head of intelligence operations. "This had better be important, Lieutenant Commander," Rourke said, his tone making clear that he doubted it would be. "I have a meeting in 15 minutes. "Sir, Miss Hill has discovered an active security breach," Vanderberg replied. "I think you need to hear what she's found." Admiral Rourke's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or irritation at having his schedule disrupted. "Go ahead, Miss Hill," he said, leaning back in his chair with the air of someone humoring a child. "Show me this breach you've supposedly discovered." Irene set her laptop on the Admiral's desk, conscious of 3 sets of skeptical eyes watching her every move. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened her presentation, but her voice remained steady as she began to explain. "For the past 6 weeks, someone has been systematically extracting classified data from the base's secure servers," she began, displaying the traffic analysis on screen. "The exfiltration occurs during routine network maintenance windows when increased data flow is expected. The packets are disguised as legitimate system updates, but the data patterns reveal anomalies consistent with unauthorized access." Captain Verhagen leaned forward, studying the graphs and charts. "How can you be certain this isn't just normal maintenance traffic?" "Because I traced the data streams," Irene replied, pulling up additional screens. "Normal maintenance traffic follows predictable patterns and terminates at authorized endpoints. This traffic is being routed through multiple proxy servers before reaching an external destination that doesn't appear in any authorized connection logs." "Where's the data going?" Commander Peterson asked, his skepticism giving way to professional interest. "I can't determine that without full system access, which I currently don't have, but I can show you the route it's taking and the approximate volume of data being stolen. Based on the packet sizes and frequency, I estimate approximately 200 gigabytes have been exfiltrated over the past 6 weeks. The room fell silent. 200 gigabytes of classified military data was catastrophic, the kind of breach that ended careers and compromised national security. Admiral Rourke's expression had shifted from dismissive to coldly focused. "Why didn't our existing security systems detect this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Because the intrusion is sophisticated," Irene explained. "Whoever implemented it understands naval network architecture intimately. They knew exactly when and how to extract data without triggering standard alerts. This isn't amateur work, sir. This is professional-grade espionage." Rourke stood abruptly, moving to stand beside Irene as he examined her laptop screen more closely. "Can you stop it?" "Yes, but I need immediate access to the compromised systems. I also need authorization to implement countermeasures that might alert the intruder that we've discovered them. If we're careful, we can trace this back to its source before shutting it down. And if we're not careful, the intruder will know we're onto them, destroy evidence, and potentially activate contingency plans we haven't discovered yet. This level of access suggests they might have planted additional backdoors into our systems." Admiral Rourke turned to Captain Verhagen. "Cancel my morning meeting. Get her full security clearance authorized immediately. Commander Peterson, I want your best intelligence analysts working with Miss Hill. Vanderberg, assemble your team and put them at her disposal." "Sir," Verhagen said carefully, "with respect, we should verify these findings before taking such drastic action. Miss Hill is a civilian contractor who's been here less than 48 hours. "Are you suggesting she fabricated this evidence?" Rourke snapped. "I'm suggesting we should confirm it through our own security personnel before disrupting base operations." Irene had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "Admiral, if I may, the evidence is verifiable by anyone with the technical knowledge to interpret it. I can walk your security team through the analysis, but every hour we delay gives the intruder more time to extract data or cover their tracks." Rourke studied her for a long moment, and Irene met his gaze steadily. She saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of risk against necessity. Finally, he nodded. "You have 12 hours, Miss Hill. Show me that this breach is real and that you can stop it. If you're right, you'll have every resource on this base at your disposal. If you're wrong, or if this is some elaborate attempt to gain unauthorized access to our systems, you'll face prosecution. Do we understand each other? Yes, sir. Good. Captain Verhagen, expedite her clearances. Miss Hill, you report directly to me until this situation is resolved. I want updates every 2 hours, and I want to know the identity of whoever is behind this breach by end of day. The next 8 hours blurred into a marathon of technical analysis, briefings, and increasingly tense discoveries. Irene worked with Commander Peterson's intelligence team, walking them through her findings and demonstrating how the breach operated. Initial skepticism gave way to grudging respect as her analysis held up under scrutiny, then to genuine alarm as they realized the scope of the compromise. By noon, they'd confirmed that the breach was worse than Irene's preliminary assessment suggested. The intruder had access not just to routine classified material, but to operational plans, personnel files, and technical specifications for the base's defense systems. Whoever was behind this had been patient and methodical, building a comprehensive picture of the base's capabilities and vulnerabilities. Irene sat in a hastily established command post, surrounded by computer screens and tired intelligence analysts. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep and her hands shook from too much coffee, but she pushed through the exhaustion. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd done before the breakdown, before she'd convinced herself that she needed easier work. We've traced the proxy chain to a server cluster in Eastern Europe, one of the analysts reported, but the trail goes cold after that. Whoever set this up knew how to cover their tracks. Irene studied the data flow patterns, looking for any detail that might provide a lead. The exfiltration timing is too precise to be random, she said, thinking aloud. They're extracting data during specific maintenance windows, which means they have intimate knowledge of our network maintenance schedule. Could be someone on the base, Commander Peterson suggested, an insider providing information to external actors. Or someone who used to work here, Irene countered, someone familiar with standard operating procedures who would know when security monitoring is minimal. Van der Berg, who'd been reviewing personnel files, looked up sharply. We had a contractor working here until 3 months ago. Dutch national named Henrik Bosch, specialized in network infrastructure, left to take a position with a private security firm. Where's this firm located? Peterson asked. Amsterdam, officially. But Bosch's social media shows he's been traveling extensively, Eastern Europe specifically. Irene felt pieces clicking into place. Pulled his access logs from when he worked here. I want to see every system he touched and every file he accessed. The logs painted a damning picture. Bosch had used his legitimate access to map the base's network architecture, identify security gaps, and create the backdoors that were now being exploited. He'd been careful, leaving no obvious traces, but the pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for. We need to shut this down now, Peterson said, before he extracts anything else. If we shut it down abruptly, we lose the chance to trace it back definitively, Irene argued. I can modify the data stream to include traceable markers that will lead us directly to whoever's receiving this information. Give me 2 more hours. Peterson looked uncertain, but before he could respond, Admiral Rourke entered the command post. He'd been monitoring their progress remotely, but his presence now suggested he wanted first-hand assessment of the situation. Status, he demanded, without preamble. Irene provided a concise update, outlining their findings about Bosch and her proposal to trace the breach to its ultimate destination. Rourke listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. 2 hours, he said finally. But, Miss Hill, if this goes wrong, if we lose more data or alert them prematurely, it's on you. Understood, sir. The next 2 hours were the most intense of Irene's professional life. She worked with surgical precision, inserting traceable code into the data stream without alerting the recipients that anything had changed. Every keystroke carried weight, every decision potentially catastrophic if executed incorrectly. The analysts watched in silence as she worked, their initial skepticism long since replaced by something approaching awe. This wasn't the nervous young woman who'd stood awkwardly in the briefing room yesterday. This was a professional operating at the peak of her capabilities, calm and focused, despite the pressure. "Tracer deployed," Irene announced at 13:47. "Now we wait for the next scheduled exfiltration at 1400 hours. The minutes crawled past. Irene forced herself to breathe steadily, to maintain the calm exterior, even as anxiety clawed at her insides. If this failed, if Bosch detected the tracer and shut down the operation, they'd lose their chance to identify his handlers and assess the full damage of the breach. At exactly 1400 hours, the breach activated as scheduled. Data began flowing through the compromised channels, carrying with it Irene's hidden markers. She watched the progress on her screen, tracking the data as it bounced through proxy servers and encrypted tunnels. "We've got movement," one of the analysts called out. "Following the tracer now." The trail led exactly where Irene had predicted, through Eastern European servers to a destination in Belgrade. But then, something unexpected happened. The data split, with copies being sent to 2 additional locations, one in Moscow, one in Beijing. "This isn't just corporate espionage," Peterson said grimly. "This is state-sponsored intelligence gathering, multiple nations coordinating access to our systems." Admiral Rourke, who'd been watching from the back of the room, moved forward. "Can we identify the specific agencies involved?" "Not yet," Irene replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "But I can map their network infrastructure and identify other potential targets. If they're hitting us, they're probably hitting other NATO installations." She worked for another 30 minutes, mapping connections and documenting the intelligence network that Bosch's breach had revealed. It was massive, far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The breach at Rotterdam was just one node in a web that potentially compromised dozens of military installations across Europe. "Sir," Irene said finally, turning to face Admiral Rourke, "I recommend we don't shut this down immediately. If we leave it active while feeding false information, we can use it to mislead hostile intelligence services while we identify and close other breaches in the network." "A deception operation," Rourke said thoughtfully. "Using their own spy network against them." "Exactly. But it would require careful coordination with other NATO installations and intelligence services. This is beyond the scope of what I can handle alone." Rourke nodded slowly, then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He extended his hand to Irene. "Miss Hill, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on appearance and age rather than capability. That was wrong, and it nearly cost us the security of this entire installation." Irene shook his hand, too exhausted to feel vindication. "Thank you, sir. But we're not finished yet." "No," Rourke agreed. "We're just beginning. Captain Verhagen. Get me the NATO Cybersecurity Command on secure comms. Commander Peterson. Coordinate with European intelligence services. And Miss Hill, you're going to brief them all on what you've found. Think you can handle that?" Irene allowed, herself a small smile. "Yes, sir, I can handle it." The briefing room at NATO Cybersecurity Command was nothing like the modest facility at Naval Station Rotterdam. Located in a secure bunker beneath Brussels, it featured wall-to-wall displays showing real-time network traffic across European military installations. Irene stood at the front of the room, facing an audience of senior officers and intelligence officials from 12 different nations, all of them waiting to hear what a 26-year-old contractor had discovered. Admiral Rourke sat in the front row, his presence both supportive and slightly intimidating. He'd insisted on accompanying her to Brussels, partly to vouch for her findings and partly, she suspected, to ensure she received credit for the discovery. The man who'd mocked her 72 hours ago had become her most vocal advocate, a transformation that still felt surreal. "Good afternoon," Irene began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. 3 days ago, I identified an active breach at Naval Station Rotterdam. What we've since discovered suggests this is part of a coordinated intelligence operation targeting NATO installations across Europe. She walked them through her findings methodically, displaying network traffic patterns and tracing the data flows that connected Rotterdam to other compromised sites. As she spoke, she watched faces shift from polite attention to genuine alarm. These were people who understood the implications of what she was describing, who could see the strategic threat hidden in the technical details. The sophistication suggests state-level resources, she continued. Multiple intelligence services coordinating access through a network of compromised contractors and vendors. They've been patient, extracting data slowly enough to avoid detection while building a comprehensive picture of NATO capabilities. General Kovac, the Hungarian commander of NATO cyber defense, interrupted. How many installations are compromised? We've confirmed breaches at 17 locations so far, but there are likely more. The pattern suggests they've been systematically targeting facilities with aging security infrastructure, places where budget constraints have delayed system upgrades. And you discovered all this from one base in Rotterdam? Kovac asked, his skepticism evident. I discovered the entry point, Irene corrected. Once we understood the methodology, we could trace it across the network. But the initial breach took advantage of vulnerabilities that have existed for months, vulnerabilities that standard security audits failed to identify. She clicked to the next slide, showing the proposed countermeasure operation. Rather than simply closing these breaches, I recommend we exploit them. We feed false information through the compromised channels, misleading hostile intelligence services while we identify and secure other vulnerabilities in the network. A deception operation of that scale would require enormous coordination, observed Colonel Dubois from French intelligence, resources, personnel, constant monitoring to maintain the fiction. And if we make a mistake, if they realize we've detected them, we lose any advantage. That's correct, Irene acknowledged, but the alternative is shutting down the breaches and hoping we've found all of them. This way, we control the information flow and potentially identify additional compromised sites through their reactions to our false intelligence. The discussion that followed was intense and technical, with officers and analysts challenging every aspect of her proposal. Irene fielded their questions with growing confidence, drawing on knowledge she hadn't accessed in years. This was the work she'd done before the breakdown, the high-stakes chess game of cyber warfare where every move had strategic implications. After 2 hours of briefing and debate, General Kovac called for a vote among the senior commanders. The proposal to implement Irene's deception operation passed with only 2 dissenting votes. She was assigned a team of 30 analysts and given broad authority to coordinate the countermeasure across NATO installations. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Rourke approached her. You handled that well, he said. Better than most officers twice your age. Thank you, sir. I meant what I said about the apology. I made assumptions about you that were wrong and potentially dangerous. If I'd trusted your initial assessment instead of dismissing you, we might have caught this breach weeks earlier. Irene chose her words carefully. Sir, I understand why you were skeptical. My background file doesn't tell the whole story. No, Rourke agreed, it doesn't. Which is something I'd like to understand better. Most of your previous employment is redacted. Even your educational credentials are vague. Who are you, really? Miss Hill? Irene had known this question would come eventually. The redactions in her file weren't accidental. They were necessary protections for operations that remained classified years after their completion. But Admiral Rourke had earned some explanation, and the success of the current operation might depend on him understanding her actual capabilities. Can we speak privately, sir? She asked. Rourke led her to a secure conference room away from the main briefing area. Once the door was sealed and the electronic countermeasures activated to prevent surveillance, he gestured for her to continue. 4 years ago, I was recruited by the European Cybersecurity Agency, Irene began. I was finishing my doctorate in cryptography at ETH Zurich when they approached me. They'd been monitoring my research on quantum-resistant encryption algorithms. How old were you? Rourke asked. 22. I'd accelerated through my undergraduate degree and went directly into the doctoral program. The ECSA wanted people who understood emerging technologies, who could think beyond conventional cybersecurity frameworks. She paused, gathering herself to discuss things she'd spent years trying to forget. My first assignment was investigating irregularities in banking transaction networks across Eastern Europe. What we discovered was a coordinated attempt to manipulate financial markets through cyber intrusion. The operation was massive, spanning multiple countries and threatening the stability of the entire European financial system. Rourke leaned forward, his expression intent. I remember reading about something like that. Market instabilities in 2021, attributed to technical glitches. Not glitches, Irene said quietly. Deliberate manipulation that we barely stopped in time. I led the team that traced the intrusions back to their source and developed the countermeasures that shut them down. The operation was classified because revealing it would have caused the exact market panic we were trying to prevent. You led that operation at 22. Technical lead, yes. We had senior analysts managing the political and strategic aspects, but the actual cyber warfare component was mine. I designed the intrusion detection algorithms and the countermeasure protocols that protected the financial networks. Understanding dawned in Rourke's eyes. That's why your file is redacted. You were involved in classified operations that can't be publicly acknowledged. 3 major operations over 2 years, Irene confirmed, each one involving threats to critical European infrastructure, financial networks, power grids, telecommunication systems. The work was necessary and important, but it destroyed me, mentally and emotionally. She found herself unable to meet his eyes as she continued. The last operation involved a coordinated attack on transportation infrastructure, air traffic control systems, railway networks, port facilities. We were racing against a countdown, knowing that if we failed, thousands of people might die. We succeeded. Barely, but the stress broke something inside me. The breakdown mentioned in your medical records, Rourke said, his voice gentler now. 6 weeks in a psychiatric hospital, followed by 6 months of intensive therapy. The doctors said I'd burned out, that I'd pushed myself too hard for too long. They recommended I step away from high-stakes work, find something less intense. She laughed bitterly. So I took contractor positions, thinking I could use my skills without the crushing pressure of national security threats. But those skills don't disappear, Rourke observed. And when you saw the breach at Rotterdam, you couldn't just document it and walk away. No, because I recognized the signature, the methodology. This is the same type of operation I spent 2 years fighting. Different actors, different targets, but the same sophisticated approach to compromising critical infrastructure. Rourke was quiet for a moment, processing everything she'd told him. Why didn't you disclose this background when you were hired? Surely your experience with the EXA would have been relevant. The operations are still classified. I can't discuss them without authorization, and even mentioning my EXA work raises questions I'm not allowed to answer. My official credentials show education and some contractor experience, but nothing about what I actually accomplished. So, you've spent the past 3 years being underestimated because you can't reveal your actual qualifications. Yes, sir. Rourke stood and walked to the window, though the secure room's reinforced glass showed only the concrete walls of the bunker corridor outside. Miss Hill, I'm going to request that portions of your file be declassified, at least for senior NATO commanders who need to understand your background. And this operation you're leading is too important to have people questioning your authority based on incomplete information. That request might be denied, sir. The operations I was involved in remain sensitive. Then I'll push harder. You've demonstrated capabilities that NATO needs desperately, capabilities we've been squandering because we couldn't see past your age and appearance. He turned back to face her. I won't let bureaucratic classification issues prevent us from using your expertise effectively. The deception operation launched 48 hours later with the precision of a military campaign. Irene coordinated from a secure facility in Brussels, working 18-hour days to manage the flow of false intelligence through the compromised networks. Her team of 30 analysts operated in rotating shifts, monitoring hostile responses and adjusting the deception to maintain credibility. The false information they fed through the breaches was carefully crafted to be believable. Modified deployment schedules, slightly altered technical specifications, training exercises that never actually occurred. Each piece of misinformation was designed to mislead without being obviously false, to build a distorted picture of NATO capabilities that would hinder hostile planning without triggering suspicion. Within a week, they began seeing results. Intelligence intercepts showed hostile services acting on the false information, repositioning assets based on fictional NATO movements. More importantly, the responses revealed additional compromised networks they hadn't previously identified. The deception operation was working better than anyone had dared hope, but the pressure was relentless. Every decision Irene made affected strategic military operations across Europe. Every piece of false intelligence had to be carefully calibrated to mislead without causing unintended consequences. She felt herself slipping back into the patterns that had led to her breakdown. Skipping meals, surviving on coffee and nervous energy, her mind constantly racing through scenarios and contingencies. Vanderberg, who'd been assigned to her team as a liaison officer, noticed first. "When did you last sleep?" he asked one morning, finding her still at her workstation from the previous day. "I'll sleep when the operation stabilizes," Irene replied, not looking up from her screens. "Irene," Vanderberg said, using her first name for the first time, "you're running yourself into the ground. I've seen this before, and it doesn't end well." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're exhibiting the same behavior patterns that led to your previous breakdown. I read your medical file. I know what happened." Irene's hands stopped moving on the keyboard. "That was 3 years ago. And you've spent those 3 years avoiding exactly this type of high-pressure situation. Now you're back in it, pushing yourself the same way, heading toward the same result." She wanted to argue, to insist that she had everything under control. But Vanderberg was right. She could feel herself fraying. The same warning signs that had preceded her collapse at the EXA. The racing thoughts, the inability to disconnect, the conviction that everything would fall apart if she wasn't constantly monitoring and adjusting. "I don't know how to do this differently," she admitted quietly. "When the stakes are this high, how do I not give everything I have?" By recognizing that sustainable effort is more valuable than heroic burnout, you're no use to anyone if you collapse again. Vanderberg pulled up a chair beside her. "We need to establish better protocols. You work 12-hour shifts maximum, with another senior analyst covering the remaining 12 hours. You take regular breaks, eat proper meals, and actually sleep in a bed instead of at your desk. What if something critical happens while I'm sleeping? Then the duty analyst will wake you, but most decisions can wait 6 hours. The hostile intelligence services aren't watching our every move in real time. We have room to breathe, but only if you let yourself use it." Admiral Rourke, who'd been monitoring the operation remotely from Rotterdam, arrived in Brussels that afternoon. He found Irene in the operations center, reviewing network traffic logs with the exhausted intensity of someone running on fumes and determination. "Miss Hill, I'm ordering you to take the rest of the day off," he said, without preamble. "Sir, I need to—" "That wasn't a request. Lieutenant Commander Vanderberg has briefed me on your condition. You're going to eat a proper meal, sleep for at least 8 hours, and then we're going to discuss sustainable operational protocols. But the deception operation will continue without you for 12 hours. I have confidence in your team, and more importantly, I have confidence that you'll be more effective after some rest than you are right now operating on exhaustion." Irene wanted to argue, but she recognized the wisdom in his words. More than that, she recognized that he was trying to prevent the same mistake he'd made before, letting assumptions and circumstances push talented people into failure. She spent that evening in her temporary quarters, forcing herself to eat and attempting to quiet the constant analysis running through her mind. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of network breaches and cascading system failures. But when she returned to the operations center the next morning, she felt more clear-headed than she had in days. 3 weeks into the deception operation, they achieved their first major breakthrough. One of the hostile intelligence services, acting on false information about a fictional vulnerability in NATO communication systems, attempted to exploit what they believed was a security gap. The attempt revealed not just their operational methods, but also the identities of several deep cover assets working within European defense contractors. Irene watched the operation unfold from the Brussels command center, coordinating with counterintelligence services across 6 countries as they moved to neutralize the exposed network. It was elegant work, the kind of multi-layered strategy that she'd specialized in during her EXA days, but this time she was managing it without sacrificing her mental health. The sustainable protocols that Van der Berg and Admiral Rourke had imposed had made the difference. Working in shifts, delegating responsibilities, actually sleeping and eating properly, all of it contributed to clearer thinking and better decision-making. She was still under pressure, still carrying enormous responsibility, but she wasn't drowning in it. "Impressive work," General Kovac commented, reviewing the results of the counterintelligence operation. "You've accomplished more in 3 weeks than most cybersecurity specialists manage in years." "I had excellent support, sir," Irene replied, gesturing to her team. This was collaborative effort across multiple agencies and installations. "Don't sell yourself short, Miss Hill. You designed this operation, coordinated the implementation, and managed to turn a security breach into an intelligence coup. That's exceptional work by any standard." The commendation felt good, but what mattered more to Irene was the growing sense that she'd found a sustainable way to do the work she was good at. She didn't have to choose between using her talents and maintaining her mental health. With the right support structure and reasonable boundaries, she could do both. Admiral Rourke arrived for his weekly in-person briefing that afternoon, and Irene provided a comprehensive update on the operation's progress. They'd identified and secured 43 compromised installations, fed misinformation that had misdirected hostile intelligence operations across Eastern Europe, and gathered evidence that would support diplomatic and legal actions against the state actors involved. "Outstanding results," Rourke said when she finished. "NATO Command is extremely pleased with the operation's success. They're also interested in retaining your services on a more permanent basis." Irene felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm suited for long-term high-stakes work." "Because of your previous breakdown? Because I know my limitations. I've learned how to manage this level of pressure for short operations, but sustaining it indefinitely is another matter." Rourke nodded thoughtfully. "What if the position was structured differently? Not constant crisis management, but developing cybersecurity protocols and training other specialists. You'd still be doing important work, but without the relentless operational pressure. Training and protocol development. NATO needs to prevent future breaches, like the one you discovered at Rotterdam. We need someone who understands both the technical aspects and the strategic implications to design better security frameworks and teach others how to implement them. That person is you." Irene considered the proposal. Teaching and system design had always interested her, and it would allow her to use her expertise without the crushing pressure of real-time crisis management. "I'd want to maintain some operational capacity," she said slowly. "When critical situations arise, I want to be available to help. But having teaching and development as my primary focus might actually work." "Then we'll structure it that way. You'll be based here in Brussels, working with NATO cyber defense to overhaul our security protocols and train the next generation of cyber specialists. When operations require your specific expertise, you'll be available. But it won't be your daily responsibility." It was, Irene realized, exactly what she needed. A way to contribute meaningfully without destroying herself in the process, a chance to use the hard-won lessons of her breakdown to build something sustainable and valuable. "I accept, sir. Thank you for understanding what I need. Thank you for teaching me not to judge people based on appearances and assumptions," Rourke replied. "I almost cost NATO an invaluable asset because I couldn't see past my own prejudices. I won't make that mistake again." 6 months after the Rotterdam breach discovery, Irene stood in a lecture hall at NATO's Cyber Defense Center, facing 30 officers from 15 different countries. They ranged in age from mid-20s to late 40s, all of them seasoned professionals who'd been selected for advanced cybersecurity training, and all of them were looking at her with varying degrees of skepticism. She recognized the expression in their eyes. It was the same look Admiral Rourke had given her that first day, the same doubt that had followed her throughout her career. Too young, too small, too quiet to possibly know what she was talking about. The difference now was that she had the confidence to handle it. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "My name is Irene Hill, and for the next 6 weeks, I'll be teaching you how to identify and counter sophisticated cyber intrusions. Some of you are probably wondering why you're being taught by someone who looks like she should still be in university." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the audience. Irene smiled slightly and continued. "That's fair. Appearances matter in this profession, which is exactly why hostile intelligence services recruit people who don't fit the stereotype of what a cyber warfare specialist looks like. They want analysts who can blend in, who people underestimate. Understanding that principle is your first lesson." She clicked to display the Rotterdam breach case study on the screen behind her. "6 months ago, I was mocked by a senior naval officer for suggesting I was qualified to handle security for his installation. 3 days later, I discovered an active breach that compromised 17 NATO facilities and exposed a coordinated intelligence operation involving multiple hostile nations. The same officer who mocked me is now one of my strongest advocates." The skepticism in the room began to shift into interest. These were professionals who respected results, and the Rotterdam operation had become legendary within NATO's cybersecurity circles. "This course will teach you the technical skills necessary to detect and counter sophisticated intrusions," Irene continued. "But more importantly, it will teach you to question assumptions. The most dangerous vulnerabilities aren't always technical. Sometimes they're human. The tendency to dismiss warnings from unexpected sources, to assume that our existing security measures are adequate, to believe that we're too careful to be compromised." Over the following weeks, Irene poured her experience into training the next generation of cybersecurity specialists. She taught them the technical skills she developed during her ECSA years, but also the strategic thinking that had made her effective. More than that, she taught them to recognize and overcome the biases that had nearly prevented her from stopping the Rotterdam breach. Admiral Rourke visited during the 4th week of training, observing from the back of the lecture hall as Irene walked her students through a complex case study. Afterward, he approached her with obvious satisfaction. "You're a natural teacher," he said. "The students respect you. They're learning, and they're challenging their own assumptions. That's exactly what NATO needs." "Thank you, sir. Though I have to admit, teaching is more exhausting than I expected. Different kind of pressure than operational work, but still demanding. But sustainable. Yes, I'm sleeping, eating properly, maintaining boundaries. Vanderberg checks in regularly to make sure I'm not slipping into old patterns." "Good, because I have a proposal for you." Rourke handed her a folder marked with high-level security classifications. "NATO is establishing a new cyber threat analysis division. We need someone to lead it, someone who understands both the technical and strategic aspects of cyber warfare, someone who's proven they can identify threats others miss and train people to do the same." Irene opened the folder, scanning the proposal. It was everything she'd been working toward, a leadership position that would allow her to shape NATO's approach to cybersecurity while maintaining the sustainable work practices she'd fought to establish. "This is a significant responsibility, sir." "It is, but you're ready for it." "More than ready. The question is whether you trust yourself enough to accept it." Irene thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the brilliant but fragile doctoral student recruited by the SESA, the burned-out analyst hospitalized for breakdown, and the underestimated contractor dismissed by those she was trying to help, and finally, the recognized expert teaching others and shaping policy at the highest levels. "I accept," she said, "with the understanding that I'll need to maintain healthy boundaries and sustainable practices." That's non-negotiable, Rourke agreed. We need you effective long-term, not brilliant, but burning out. The division will be structured to support that. 1 year after the Rotterdam breach, Irene stood in Admiral Rourke's office at Naval Station Rotterdam, looking out the window at the harbour where her journey had begun. She'd returned for the official ceremony commemorating the breach's discovery and the successful counterintelligence operation that had followed. The ceremony was scheduled for that afternoon, but Rourke had asked her to arrive early for a private conversation. He handed her a sealed envelope bearing official NATO markings. Your security clearance declassification came through, he said. Not everything, but enough that senior commanders will understand your background and qualifications. You won't have to hide your EXA work anymore. Irene opened the envelope, scanning the partially declassified record of her service, seeing her accomplishments, acknowledged officially, without redactions obscuring her contributions, felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. Thank you, sir. This means more than you might realize. I have some idea. I've spent the past year learning about the operations you led, the crises you prevented. You saved thousands of lives before most people your age have even started their careers. That deserves recognition, not dismissal. The ceremony that afternoon was attended by senior NATO officials, base personnel, and representatives from the intelligence services that had worked on the counter-operation. Irene received commendations from 3 different nations and a personal letter of appreciation from the NATO Secretary-General. But the moment that mattered most came after the formal proceedings, when a young contractor approached her nervously. The woman couldn't have been more than 23, slight and uncertain in her movements. Miss Hill, I'm Anna Vryheid. I just started working in the cybersecurity division here. I wanted to thank you for what you did. Not just discovering the breach, but for showing people like us that we belong in this field. People like us, Irene asked gently. Young women who don't look like what people expect specialists to look like, who get dismissed and underestimated constantly. You proved that competence matters more than appearance, and that gives me hope. Irene saw herself in Anna's anxious expression, remembered every time she'd been mocked or dismissed or told she wasn't suited for the work she excelled at. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't belong, she said. Trust your skills, prepare thoroughly, and when the moment comes to prove yourself, be ready to exceed every expectation. As the evening concluded, Irene found herself standing on the same spot where she'd stood that first morning, watching the sun set over the harbour. Admiral Rourke joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered her one, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Any regrets? He asked finally. About accepting the position? None. About the journey it took to get here? Some. I wish I'd been believed from the start rather than having to prove myself through crisis. But I suppose that's the reality for a lot of people. In situations like mine. It shouldn't be. And partly because of you, it's changing. The officers who went through your training program are questioning their assumptions, looking past appearances to evaluate actual capabilities. That cultural shift might be your most important contribution. Irene smiled. I just wanted to do good work and be recognized for it. Everything else was just survival. Sometimes survival is the most radical act, Rourke observed. Refusing to give up when everyone tells you you're not enough. Pushing through despite the dismissal and doubt. That takes courage. Most people never have to find. As they walked back toward the command center, Irene reflected on how completely her life had transformed. From the underestimated contractor mocked on her first day to the leader of NATO's Cyber Threat Analysis Division. From someone struggling to maintain her mental health while pursuing meaningful work to someone who'd found a sustainable way to contribute at the highest levels. The journey hadn't been easy. The wounds from being dismissed and underestimated hadn't fully healed, and probably never would. But she'd learned to carry them without letting them define her, to use the memory of being undervalued as motivation to ensure others didn't face the same barriers. Her phone buzzed with a message from Vanderberg. Congratulations on the ceremony. Don't forget, you have that training session tomorrow at 0900. Get some sleep. Irene laughed, appreciating his continued vigilance about her work-life balance. She'd found not just professional success, but a support system that helped her maintain it sustainably. That was perhaps the real victory, the proof that she could be both excellent at her work and healthy in her life. The quiet contractor who'd been mocked by an admiral had become the respected leader shaping NATO's cyber defense strategy, not by changing who she was, but by refusing to accept others' limitations on who she could become. And in doing so, she'd opened doors for everyone who came after her, everyone who'd been told they didn't look like they belonged. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is prove that appearance doesn't determine capability. Sometimes, the greatest victory is simply refusing to quit when everyone expects you to fail. Irene Hill had done both, and in the process had changed not just her own future, but the future of everyone who would follow in her footsteps. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.